Thorne Kesler held a spread most men in the county only talked about when whiskey loosened their tongues. Long acres drank in the sunlight just right, rich black soil that promised something back if you worked it, and open pasture that rolled out toward the horizon like it had no plans of ever stopping. But right in the heart of it all, the house sat still. Too still. It always had. Thorne lived alone at the far edge of town, where the road thinned into dust and the fences stopped lining up straight. His ranch didn't belong to the town, and it didn't belong to the wild either. It sat somewhere in between, claimed but distant, much like the man who ran it. His parents had passed years back. Too soon, too close together to make sense of. Music. One sickness, one heartbreak, and just like that, a place that once carried laughter and routine turned hollow, filled with nothing but echoes and drifting dust. When offers came, good money, quick deals, men in polished boots talking big about expansion, Thorne turned every one of them down. Music. He didn't argue, didn't justify it. He just said, no. After that, he stopped riding into town unless there was no other choice. Music. He sold his crops through Corvin Hale, picked up supplies at sunrise or near sundown. Music. He didn't waste time in saloons, didn't show his face at church gatherings, didn't linger along those wooden sidewalks where folks traded gossip just as easy as they traded goods. Thorne wasn't unfriendly. He tipped his hat when spoken to, paid fare, lent a hand when a fence gave way or a calf strayed too far. But he never stuck around long enough to get tangled in conversations that came with expectations. That alone made people uneasy. In a town that ran on alliances, bloodlines, old debts, and quiet loyalties, Thorne Kesler stood apart. He wasn't part of any circle. Didn't try to be. Some folks figured he thought he was above them. Others said he was hiding something. Most just kept their distance. Man who don't pick a side ain't worth trusting, someone once muttered over at the feed store. Thorne heard it. He always did. Out here, sound traveled. But he never answered. Land didn't ask questions. Music. Cattle didn't whisper. The wind didn't care who stood beside you. That suited him just fine. October came dry that year, the kind where the sky stretched pale and endless, and the earth cracked open without a sound. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, painting everything in a dull copper glow. Dust lifted with every step, clinging to boots and coat hems like it wanted to stay. Music. Thorne wrapped up his work the same way he always did. Slow, steady, not a single wasted motion. He shut the barn, checked the troughs, and hauled a bucket of water back from the well. His hands were rough, sure around the handle. Music. It felt like any other day, just another line scratched into a long, quiet ledger of days that all looked the same. He was already thinking about supper, something simple, something eaten alone, when he heard it. A sound near the old iron gate, not loud, not a call, not a knock, just a faint scrape, like something dragging itself across the dirt. A pause. Then another sound, uneven, uncertain. Thorne stopped mid-step. Out here, every sound meant something. Music. Coyotes cried sharp and clear. Horses shifted with breath and weight. The wind moved clean and steady. This didn't belong to any of that. He set the bucket down slow, wiping his hands on his jeans. The gate stood at the far edge of his land, rusted through in places. Music its hinges stiff from years of neglect. Thorne rarely bothered to shut it all the way. Didn't need to. No one came out this far unless they had a reason. He started toward it, boots crunching over dry ground, the sinking sun casting long shadows behind him. As he got closer, he saw it. A figure slumped against the fence, barely holding herself upright, fingers locked tight around the cold iron, like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. She was small, covered in dust. Still. For a long moment, Thorne didn't move. The October wind slipped past him, carrying the scent of dry grass and something else. Weariness? Music, maybe? Or fear? Just moments ago, the day had been nothing more than routine. Now, something had shifted. Thorne Kesler didn't know it yet, but the life he had built, careful, stubborn, alone, had just reached its breaking point. And it hadn't started with a threat. Music. It started with a weak, uncertain sound at a forgotten gate. She stood just inside its shadow, not quite on the road anymore, but not yet part of the land beyond it. Like even the ground itself hadn't decided whether to claim her. She was Apache. That much became clear the second Thorne Kesler truly took her in. Her clothes had been worn down by time and hard miles. The fabric faded, patched in places where survival mattered more than pride. Music. Dust clung to every edge, worked deep into the seams like it had settled there for good. The coat on her shoulders hung loose, either too big or too old to remember its shape. The sleeves were frayed where fingers had pulled and tugged one too many times. Her skirt was stiff with dried mud, hardened from days on the road. Nothing she wore looked new. Nothing looked like it had ever been given freely. Her feet told a harsher story. One shoe had split wide along the side. The other barely held together with a strip of cloth tied tight. When she shifted her weight, Thorne caught a glimpse beneath the dust. Raw skin, blisters torn open, heels cracked and bleeding. She had walked miles. Maybe more than that. The kind of distance a person doesn't cross unless there's nowhere left to stop. Her face was drawn thin with exhaustion, cheeks hollow, lips pale and dry, but her eyes, dark, steady, unyielding, didn't drop when she realized he was watching. They locked onto his without hesitation. Thorne had seen plenty of looks in his life: anger, fear, hunger, shame. This wasn't any of those. This was something harder. A look that said she'd already lost everything there was to lose, and still refused to fall. She didn't ask for food, didn't reach out, didn't crumble at his boots. She just held on to that fence and spoke. "I got nowhere else to go." Her voice came out rough, scraped thin by thirst and distance, but the words themselves held steady. No shake, no apology. The wind slipped between them, dragging red dust across the open land. Music. Somewhere off in the distance, a loose wire rattled against a post. The ranch seemed to hold its breath. Thorne didn't answer right away. He already understood what this meant. Not just for him, but for anyone who might see it. Music, an Apache woman standing at the gate of a white man's ranch. That wasn't something small. It wasn't neutral. Music. It carried weight, history, the kind of history that never really settled, no matter how many years passed or how many papers claimed it had. If someone from town caught sight of her here, questions would start. And if the wrong man saw her, it wouldn't stop at questions. Accusations would follow. And once those started, they had a way of turning into something worse. Thorne glanced down the road behind her. Music. Empty. For now. "You know where you are?" he said at last, his voice low, measured. She gave a single nod. "I do." "You know this ain't town land?" Another nod, slower this time. "I'm not asking for town," she said. "Just a place to stand." There it was again. That same refusal to beg. That quiet insistence on being seen as more than something to deal with or push aside. Thorne felt something tighten in his chest. Unexpected, but familiar. The same weight he'd felt years ago, standing by his parents' graves while folks whispered just out of reach. the same silent judgment that never cared for truth. People liked to think Apache women were loud when they wanted something, or dangerous, music, or cunning. She wasn't any of that. She was tired. And still standing, Thorne rested his hand on the iron gate, the metal bit cold against his palm, rough with rust. That gate had been there longer than him, longer than his parents, longer than the town ever bothered to remember. Opening it would be easy. Living with what came after wouldn't. He could send her back, point her toward the road, tell himself it wasn't his problem. Plenty of men would have done just that, and slept just fine. But Thorne didn't move. He studied her again. The way she held herself upright through the strain, the set of her jaw even as her fingers trembled around the iron. This wasn't desperation playing at pride. This was the end of the line. At last he pulled the gate open. The hinge screamed loud and sharp, a long metallic groan that cut through the stillness like a warning. The sound carried farther than he liked. She flinched at it, then steadied herself. Music. "Come on," Thorne said, stepping aside. She hesitated. Not because she feared him, but like she'd learned the hard way that every invitation came with a price. Then she stepped through. Her boots left faint tracks in the dirt, uneven, but determined. Thorne closed the gate behind her, the latch falling into place with a heavy, final click. For a moment, neither of them spoke. This wasn't mercy. Thorne Kesler understood that well. Mercy was something people talked about when they wanted to feel better about themselves. Mercy carried weakness with it. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. Recognition. He hadn't opened that gate because she was Apache. He hadn't done it because she was a woman. He'd opened it because he knew that look in her eyes. The look of someone the world had already decided to erase. And as the last light of evening settled deep across the land, Thorne Kesler knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. The lamp burned low on the rough wooden table, its flame flickering each time the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Shadows stretched long across the ceiling, bending and shifting, making the room feel smaller. Closer. Outside, the land had gone still, but inside, it felt like time itself had slowed down to listen. Zyra sat across from him, both hands wrapped around a chipped enamel cup he'd filled with water. Music. She hadn't taken a single sip. Her hands looked steady now, but only because she was holding them there by force. "You don't have to say anything," Thorne said after a while. She shook her head once. "I do." Her voice came softer this time. Not weaker, just worn thin. The kind of tired music that came from carrying too much for too long without ever setting it down. She told him she'd left her people when she was still young. Not because she was cast out. Not because she felt shame. But because she wanted something different. She wanted to choose her own path. To stand on her own in a world that didn't leave much room for Apache women to do either. The town had offered work. Honest work, they said. Long hours, low pay, but steady. She took it without question. Learned fast. Showed up before anyone else. Stayed after everyone had gone. Kept her head down. She thought that was enough. "It never is," Thorne said quietly. A faint, hollow smile touched her lips. "I figured that out. At first, it was just the looks. The kind that lingered a second too long. Eyes tracking her every move across the room. She learned to square her shoulders, keep her gaze forward, pretend she didn't notice when laughter died the moment she stepped closer, or when men brushed past her slower than they needed to. Music. Then came the words, half jokes, half warnings, said with smiles but sharp underneath, just loud enough for her to hear. Little reminders, that she didn't belong. Didn't matter how hard she worked, didn't matter how careful she was. And then there was Varric Holt. She didn't say his name right away. When she finally did, it came out flat, stripped clean of feeling, like she'd worn it down repeating it too many times in her own head. Varric was everywhere in that town. His family owned land, stores, influence. They didn't have to raise their voices. People moved aside for them without thinking. Rules bent, quiet, and easy. He noticed her because he expected to be noticed back. At first, folks called him charming. She called it something else, persistent. Music. He started showing up more often where she worked, found reasons to stay longer than he should, talked to her like she was something he could buy, if he just found the right words, the right tone. She told him no, more than once. Calm, clear. His smile never slipped. But something behind it did. Something colder. Something that promised trouble. A few days later, money went missing. Not much, not to a family like the Holts, but enough to matter, enough to cause a stir. No one checked the books. No one asked who'd been near the register. No one looked twice. Music. They just looked at her. The Apache girl, the outsider, the quiet one with no one in town to speak her name. She said she didn't take it, swore it, but her words never had a chance. In a place like that, innocence didn't need proving. Guilt did, and music, she had nothing they were willing to hear. They let her go before the sun even set. No pay, no apology. Just turned backs, and a door closing behind her like it had been waiting to. By nightfall, the story had already taken root. It always did. Lies rode faster than truth ever could. Garrick Brigg didn't even bother pretending to wrestle with the decision. He told her flat to gather her things and be gone by morning. Said he wouldn't have trouble under his roof. She'd laughed then, short, empty, without any real sound behind it. Trouble. That's what they had decided she was. For days, she went door to door, asking for work, any kind. The feed store, the laundry, even the gas pump out at the edge of town. Every time she saw it in their faces first, that flicker of recognition, before the answer came. "That's her," they whispered. Music. No questions, no second chances, just a judgment already settled. After a while, she stopped asking. The road leading out of town stretched long and hard. Every step away from it felt lighter, even as her body began to give out. She kept walking because stopping meant turning back, and turning back meant accepting a lie as truth. When her voice fell quiet, the room followed. Thorne leaned back in his chair, jaw set tight. He didn't need to ask who had taken the money. He already knew. Music. Men like Varric Holt didn't steal because they needed to. They stole because they could. And nobody questioned him? Thorne asked. She shook her head. Why would they? The lamp flickered again, throwing her face in and out of shadow. What had been taken from her wasn't just a job, or a place to sleep, or a few dollars in wages. It was her name, her place, her right to stand somewhere without being watched. Thorne knew that kind of loss, knew it deeper than he liked to admit. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing along the cabin walls like something restless. And somewhere out there in the dark, the town kept moving, holding tight to the version of the story it had already chosen. She'd lost her job in a single afternoon. No meeting, no questions. Music. Just a sentence tossed across the counter, eyes already looking past her, hands already moving on to the next thing. They took the apron from her, held the door open. Not out of kindness, but because they wanted her gone. By the time the sun slipped behind the rooftops, she'd lost her room too. Garrick Brigg never asked for her side. Didn't need it. The rumor had beaten her there, carried on whispers and sidelong glances. He stood in the doorway of her small rented room, arms folded, keys heavy in his hand. "I don't want trouble," he said, like trouble was something she carried with her. She packed what little she had into a worn bag, folded her clothes tight, wrapped a small charm in cloth and tucked it away. Nothing else mattered. That room had never truly been hers. Just a borrowed space where she'd pretended she might have a future. When she stepped back onto the street, the town felt different. Not louder, not openly cruel. Just closed. Doors that once opened without thought now hesitated, then stayed shut. Conversations dipped low when she passed. Folks who used to offer polite smiles now stared at the dirt, or looked music straight through her like she wasn't there anymore. The whispers followed her anyway, some quiet, some not. She stole, knew it. Should have never come here to begin with. Zyra kept walking, faster now, shoulders set firm, refusing to give them the satisfaction they were waiting for. She didn't argue, didn't beg. In a place like that, words didn't clear your name. They only made you look weak enough to be crushed. To the Dustvale folk, it was nothing more than another dismissal, another eviction, just bad luck folks would mention for a day or two before moving on to something else. But to her, it was something deeper. It was being pushed off land that still carried the memory of her people beneath its streets. It was being told, without anyone saying it outright, that she had no right to stand there. Not now. Music. Not ever. The injustice didn't come loud. There were no raised voices, no fists thrown. It came quiet, wrapped in politeness, dressed up in rules and assumptions that made fighting back feel useless. By the second day, she stopped knocking on doors. Each refusal hit harder than the last, not because she believed them, but because every no only confirmed what she already knew. The town had made its choice, and it hadn't chosen her. That night, she slept beneath a sagging lean-to on music, behind an abandoned shed at the edge of town. The ground was cold, the air biting sharper than she expected. She pulled her jacket tight around her and stared up at the stars, wondering when the world had narrowed into something this small. By morning, she was gone. No goodbye. No looking back. She followed the dirt road that stretched away from the tight cluster of buildings and out into open country. Every step carried her farther from judgment, farther from accusation. But it took something from her, too. The miles dragged on, longer than they ever looked on paper. The sun climbed high, then drifted west, and still she walked. Her feet burned, blisters tore open, dust clung to her skin, filled her mouth, blurred the line where earth met sky. She passed fences she didn't recognize, lines drawn across land that had once been open. Past signs warning trespassers to stay out of places that had never needed permission before. There were moments she thought about stopping, just sitting down, letting the road decide for her. But stopping meant waiting. And waiting meant letting someone else decide where she belonged. So she kept moving. By late afternoon, her thoughts had narrowed down to one thing: music. One place, Thorne Kesler's ranch. She'd heard the name in town, the way folks talked about something they didn't quite understand. A man who kept to himself. Land that didn't answer to the council or bow to the sheriff's quiet pressure. A place far enough out that it slipped past everyone's concern. It wasn't hope. Music. It was what you turned to when there was nothing left. As the road thinned and the fences leaned with age, her legs began to shake beneath her. the edges of her vision blurred. Still, she kept going, driven by something deeper, music than hunger or fear. She reached the gate just as the light began to soften. By the time she leaned against that cold iron, gripping it just to stay upright, she had crossed more than miles. She had crossed the line between being unwanted and being nowhere at all. And when Thorne Kesler opened that gate, he wasn't just letting her step onto his land. He was breaking the quiet, final judgment the town had already passed on her. Thorne didn't bring her inside right away. He led her from the gate, along the dirt path toward the house, keeping his pace slow enough that she could follow without falling behind. The sun was already dipping low, stretching long shadows across the yard. The land felt wide and exposed, but not cruel. It waited the way old land does, silent, watchful. Inside, the cabin carried the faint smell of wood smoke and dust. Nothing polished, music, nothing arranged for show, just a table worn down by years of use, 2 mismatched chairs, and a low-hanging lamp, its glass dimmed with age. Thorne Kesler set the lantern down on the table and turned to face her. "This ain't town," he said, voice calm but firm. "Things run different out here." Zyra gave a single nod. She already understood that. It was the whole reason she had come. "I'm not offering charity," he went on, steady and direct. "Never believed in it. Charity leaves people owing debts they never agreed to." Her jaw tightened slightly, not out of offense, but something closer to relief. "If you stay," he continued, "you work, same as anybody else." He laid it out plain, piece by piece. No soft edges, music, no hidden meaning. There was work, cleaning, cooking, keeping the books in order, tending the house when he was out working the land. He'd pay her in cash every week. Fair pay. No delays. No excuses. She'd have her own room. A real one. A door she could close. A bed that belonged to her for as long as she stayed. Then he paused, just long enough to make sure she was listening. "There won't be any touching," he said. Music. No favors. No expectations beyond the work. He held her gaze as he spoke, not looking away, not softening the words. Music. "You don't owe me anything outside what we agree on. You keep your name, you keep your choices, you walk away whenever you want." The room went still. She hadn't interrupted him once. When he finished, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For a moment, she said nothing. Thorne waited. Music. He didn't push. Deals like this only meant something if both sides stepped into them willingly. Finally, she spoke. "You're not trying to save me." "No," Thorne answered. "I'm trying to keep things straight." That mattered. To her, it mattered more than food, more than a roof. She'd lived too long under other people's assumptions, what they thought she needed, what they thought she owed. Help had been offered before, but it always came tied up in expectations, in glances that measured and judged. This was different. This was a trade. 2 people standing level with each other, even if the world outside that fence refused music to see it that way. She straightened a little, shoulders lifting like something inside her had been set back where it belonged. "I can work," she said. "Hard." "I don't doubt that," Thorne replied. He stood and motioned toward the hallway. "Room's at the end. Used to be my mother's." He didn't say anything more. No apology, no story behind it. Just the truth. The room itself was plain. A narrow bed, a dresser with one drawer hanging loose, a window that opened out onto wide fields instead of walls. The floor creaked under her step, but the place felt solid. Real. She set her bag down careful, like she didn't want to leave a mark. When she turned back, something in her eyes had changed. Not hope, not quite, but something steady. "I accept," she said. Thorne gave a single nod. That was music enough. Later, when the lamp burned low and the house settled into its quiet, nighttime sounds, Zyra sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence settle around her. Not the kind of silence that pressed in and accused, the kind that gave space to breathe. For the first time in days, her back rested against a wall that didn't feel temporary. Out on the porch, Thorne stood alone a moment longer, listening to the land stretch out into the dark. He knew what folks would say if word got out. He knew the questions, the suspicion, the trouble waiting just beyond the fence line. But he knew this, too. He hadn't taken her in out of kindness. He'd offered her work, respect, a place earned, not handed out, on land that didn't belong to gossip or opinion, only to those willing to stand on it straight, and for a woman who had lost everything else. That kind of bargain, simple, firm, unbreakable, was worth more than anything the town could ever promise. The days that followed moved quiet. Not the heavy kind of silence Thorne had grown used to. The kind that settled into the walls and reminded him what was gone. Music, but something lighter. A working silence. The kind shaped by footsteps, by routine, by things getting done without needing to be said out loud. Zyra was up before first light. Thorne would catch the faint creak of floorboards as she moved through the house. Quiet, careful, every step placed with purpose. By the time the sky started to gray at the edges, the kitchen was already alive. Music, water warming slow over the stove, a pan heating steady, never rushed. She wasted nothing. Not fuel, not food. Everything had its place. Everything had its use. She cleaned the house like it wasn't hers to claim, but hers to respect. Dust vanished from corners Thorne hadn't even noticed in years. The table was wiped down every night. The porch swept clean each morning, not because it needed it, but because it mattered. Her cooking stayed simple. Beans left to simmer, music low and steady, bread baked slow, vegetables cut clean and careful. Roots, stems, nothing music thrown away, unless it truly had no purpose left. At first, meals were quiet. Just the two of them sitting across from each other, eating without hurry, without forcing words into the silence just to fill it. Thorne never said much about it. But he noticed. He noticed the way the house smelled different now, less stale, more like something alive again. He noticed the books, too. One afternoon, while he was out mending a fence, he glanced through the window and saw her sitting at the table, pencil in hand, brow tight with focus. Later, he checked the numbers. Mistakes he'd missed for months were corrected. Balances lined up. Small losses, ones he hadn't even seen, were quietly fixed. She never said a word about it, just left the ledger where it belonged. That told Thorne more than anything else. She meant what she said. She carried herself the way she'd been taught, aware, measured, took only what she needed, returned tools clean, left every place better than she found it. Out in the back, tending the small garden behind the house. Music she moved with patience. Didn't force the soil, worked with it, like she was listening instead of telling it what to do. The land answered. Not in loud ways. Not all at once. But in the small things, Thorne hadn't realized he'd been missing. The chickens laid more steady. The soil held moisture longer. Even the cattle moved calmer, like something in the ground had shifted beneath them. Thorne found himself finishing work earlier than usual. Some days he didn't need to. Still, he did. He'd wash up, hang his hat by the door, and step out onto the porch as the sun started to drop low. Music. He'd settle into the old chair his father used to sit in, listening to the wind roll through the grass. Sometimes Zyra would join him. Not always. But when she did, she'd sit on the steps, arms resting loose on her knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. That's when they talked. Not about the town, not about what had been taken from either of them. Music, just small things. Thorne told her about his parents, how Kesler could read a storm just by watching how the birds flew low, how Lenora Kesler used to set wildflowers in jars along the windows, even when times were lean. Music. Zyra listened without cutting in, without pity. When she spoke, her words came slow, steady, about growing up close to the land, about learning early that wasting anything was a kind of disrespect, about silence, not as something empty, but as something that gave space for thought to settle. They were different in 100 ways. Different pasts, different scars. But there was one thing they shared, even if neither of them said it out loud. They didn't belong to that town. Thorne had walked away from it. Zyra had been driven out, same distance, same edge, watching a world that never quite made room for either of them. And in that quiet space between them, something began to take shape. Not love. Not yet. Something quieter. Understanding. There were nights Thorne woke to the faint sound of movement from her room. Soft footsteps crossing the floor, a quiet pause near the window. He never asked. Music never stepped in. He knew what it meant to carry things that only showed themselves after dark. One evening, a storm came in fast. Thunder cracked hard against the sky, rattling the walls without warning. Thorne found Zyra in the kitchen, standing still, both hands braced against the table. "It'll pass," he said, voice low. She nodded. And it did. Music. By morning, the air smelled clean, like the world had been rinsed fresh. The land looked different. Cleared, renewed. That was when Thorne realized something had changed. The ranch didn't feel like a place he was waiting to walk away from anymore. It felt like something being rebuilt. Slowly, honestly. Two people moving through it side by side. Different pasts. Same distance from the world that had already judged them. And in the steady rhythm of work, in the quiet stretch of evenings, the ranch, long neglected, long silent, began to breathe again. The first time Zyra rode back into town alone, Thorne didn't stop her. He stood on the porch and watched as she saddled the horse. Her movements were calm, deliberate, no hesitation, no rush. She adjusted the reins, checked the cinch, and swung into the saddle with music, the same quiet resolve she carried in everything she did. "I'll be back before dark," she said. Thorne gave a small nod. "Take the long way if you need to." She understood. The town hadn't changed just because she'd found a place beyond its reach. By the time she returned, the sun was already dipping low. Thorne knew something was wrong the moment her boots hit the ground. Her shoulders were tight. Her eyes stayed down as she tied off the reins, fingers moving too fast. "How was it?" he asked. "Fine," she said. It wasn't. The town had welcomed her the only way it knew how now. Cold, quiet, cutting. Eyes followed her from one doorway to the next. Conversations dropped the second she stepped inside. Laughter died before it ever reached her. A woman behind the counter hesitated before taking her money, like she had to think twice about touching it. Someone muttered a name under their breath, one she hadn't heard since she was a child. Another voice laughed as she passed. No one blocked her. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The cruelty had learned to stay quiet. And somehow, that made it worse. She bought what she came for and left without turning back. The road out of town felt longer this time. Music. Every mile weighed down by words that hadn't been spoken out loud. That night she barely ate. Thorne didn't push her. He'd learned something by then, that silence wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes, it was a kind of respect. But the town didn't stop with whispers. A few days later, the sound of an engine cut through the afternoon stillness. Too loud, too certain of itself. Thorne straightened where he stood near the barn as a polished truck rolled up to the gate, tires throwing dust like it owned the road. Varric Holt leaned back against the hood when Thorne stepped forward. He looked exactly like Thorne expected. Clean coat, polished boots, a smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Well now," Varric said, his gaze sliding past Thorne toward the house. "Didn't figure you for the charitable kind." "What do you want?" Thorne asked. Varric gave a low chuckle. "Music. Just thought I'd offer a little friendly advice. Folks in town are starting to talk." Thorne didn't respond. Varric pushed off the hood and stepped closer. "You're keeping something around the town doesn't want. Apache girl, light fingers, bad reputation." Thorne's jaw tightened. "She works here. That's it." "Oh yeah?" Varric's smile thinned. "You really planning to tie your name to hers? People already think you're strange." He leaned in, voice dropping. "This'll finish the job." A pause. "Send her off, or I make sure Quentin Drax comes riding out here. Doesn't matter if it's a frame job or not. You really think they'll take your word over mine?" Thorne didn't move. Varric straightened, satisfied enough. "Just looking out for you," he said lightly. Then he climbed back into the truck and drove off, leaving dust and something heavier hanging in the air. Inside the house, Zyra had heard every word. By the time Thorne stepped through the door, her bag was already sitting on the table. Packed, neat, careful, just like before. "I'm leaving," she said. "No," Thorne answered. Not loud, just certain. She shook her head. "He's right. They'll come after you next. You don't deserve that. This ain't your fault, Zyra. That's never stopped them." Her voice didn't crack. That unsettled him more than tears ever could. "I'm not going to be the reason they take this place from you," she went on. "You gave me work. You gave me respect. That was enough." She reached for her bag, lifting it. Thorne stepped in, steady, and took it from her hands. "You really think that's all this is?" he asked. She looked up then, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. "It should be. It isn't." He set the bag back down on the table. "This place was dying long before you showed up. Truth is, so was I. You didn't bring trouble out here. You brought this land back to life." She swallowed hard. "Thorne, I know what they'll music say," he cut in, voice low but firm. "Heard it my whole life." He paused, choosing his words with care. "I don't belong to them. Never did." His eyes held hers. "And neither do you." The room felt tighter now, like the air itself had drawn in. She let out a breath, her shoulders shaking despite how hard she tried to steady them. "I don't want to ruin you." Thorne stepped closer. "You won't." Music. "But walking away because they're cruel, that will." For a long moment she stood there, caught between holding on to herself and surviving what came next. Then, slowly, she nodded. Outside, the land stayed quiet, but something had shifted. The prejudice hadn't eased. It had just made its move. And neither of them could pretend this was only about work anymore. By nightfall, the wind had turned sharp. It slipped through the cracks in the boards, pressing against the house like it was testing it, the way winter always did before it settled in. Outside, the fields lay dark and bare, the last light draining into a cold blue dusk. Zyra stood near the door, coat pulled on, her bag resting at her feet. Thorne watched her in silence. The quiet between them wasn't the same anymore. It felt tight, stretched thin by everything left unsaid. He knew if she walked out, if that door opened and closed behind her, something would be gone for good. "Don't go," he said. She didn't turn. "I have to." "You don't." Now she faced him, her eyes steady, though exhaustion sat heavy around them. "This place is all you've got left." "Music. I won't be the reason it's taken from you." Thorne stepped forward. "They don't get to decide that." "You heard him. I've heard men like him my whole life. They don't change." His voice stayed calm, but there was iron underneath it now. "What changes is who we listen to." She shook her head. "You don't know what it's like when they decide who you are before you even open your mouth." "I do," he said quietly. The words surprised even him. He moved to the table, resting both hands against its worn surface. "This ranch." He paused, searching for the right way to say it. "It hasn't been alive in a long time, not really." She frowned. "You kept it going." "That ain't the same." He looked around the room. The walls that once held laughter, the chair Thorne Kesler used to sit in. Music, now pushed back, empty. "After my folks passed, this place turned into something I just endured. I worked it, kept it running." His gaze lifted back to hers. "But I wasn't living in it." His voice lowered. "It was quiet in a way that eats at you." She started to speak, then stopped. "You came here," Thorne went on, "and you didn't try to fix things with big words or gestures. You didn't shrink yourself down, didn't act grateful." He shook his head slightly. "You just worked. You respected the land. You respected yourself." The wind rattled the windows, marking each word. "And little by little," he said, "this place started breathing again." Her hands trembled at her sides. "I'm not going back to that," Thorne added. "Those nights where all that's waiting is silence, and ghosts." "Music." She took a small step back. "Thorne, this isn't—" "It is," he said. "For me, it is." He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "This ain't about saving you, or protecting you." His voice dropped. "It's about choosing how I live." Her breath caught. "If standing beside you means the town turns its back on me," he continued, "then it was never mine to begin with." She searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for anything she could hold on to and argue against. There was nothing there. "You're asking too much," she whispered. Music. "I'm asking you to stay." Outside, the wind rose, strong enough now to drag loose dirt across the porch. Somewhere out in the distance, a fence creaked under the strain. Beyond the ranch, the world felt cold, unyielding, full of watchful eyes and quiet judgment. Music, just waiting to close in. Inside, the air carried a different weight. Not safe, but honest. Zyra swallowed. "If I stay, they won't stop." "I know." "They'll come at you harder." "I know." "And you're still standing here." Thorne gave a single nod. "Because this ain't just about love." The word settled between them. Fragile, undeniable. "It's about choosing people over fear," he said. "Truth over comfort. Standing where you know you belong, even when it costs you." Tears gathered in her eyes, uninvited, unwanted. She had learned long ago never to cry in front of men who might see it as weakness. But this was different. This wasn't a plea. It was an offering. Slowly she bent and picked up her bag. Then, just as slowly, she set it back down. The wind slammed against the house again, like it was testing the walls. She lifted her eyes to his. "If I stay," she said, her voice steady, music despite the tears, "I won't be hidden." "You won't be," Thorne said. "I won't stay quiet. I wouldn't ask you to." She nodded once. The choice wasn't easy, but it was complete. Outside, the cold wind swept hard across the land, carrying with it the weight of what was coming. Inside, two people stood facing each other, having chosen, deliberately, openly, to stand together. And Thorne knew that choice would change everything. The truth didn't come crashing in with noise or force. It never did. It came quiet. The way it always does, when it's been buried too long. It started on a cold morning when a battered old sedan turned off the road and rolled up toward Thorne's ranch. The tires crunched soft against the gravel, almost hesitant, like even the machine understood it was crossing into something fragile. An older woman stepped out. Her back was slightly bent. Her hair had gone fully gray, pulled tight at the base of her neck. She moved slow, careful. But her eyes were sharp, clear in a way that told Thorne she hadn't come here by chance. She'd been part of that town for as long as anyone could remember. The kind of woman who watched more than she spoke, and remembered the things others chose to forget. "I need to talk," she said. "To both of you." Inside the house, she set a small wooden box on the table. Its edges were worn smooth, polished by years of being handled. Music. No one touched it at first. "I kept this," the woman said. "Didn't know why back then, just knew. Something about it wasn't right." She opened the box. Inside, neatly stacked bills. Counted. Folded. Untouched. The exact amount that had supposedly gone missing. Zyra's breath caught. "I found it in Varric Holt's truck," Morel Voss continued, her voice steady but tight with something held back. "Parked behind the hardware store. Figured it was gambling money, or worse." She paused. "Then I heard what they did to you." Her gaze hardened. "And I remembered." She spoke then of something buried deep. Another girl, years back. Music. Not Apache. Not protected either. Same pattern. Attention, rejection, accusation, silence. That girl had left town before anyone thought to ask questions. "I didn't speak up then," Morel said quietly. "Told myself it wasn't my business." A breath. "I won't make that mistake twice." Truth, once spoken. Music doesn't stay alone for long. Word spread. Not the wild kind, twisted by gossip, but the careful kind. The kind passed between people who had seen enough, and finally refused to look away. One woman stepped forward, then another. Their stories lined up, details matched, timelines fit too clean to ignore. And slowly, Varric Holt's confidence began to crack. Quentin Drax, who had spent years looking the other way whenever the Holt name came up, couldn't afford to do it anymore. The box was taken in as evidence. Statements were written, records pulled and examined. Day by day, the proof stacked higher, until it became too heavy to push aside. Varric was brought in for questioning. Music. He walked into that room like he owned it, relaxed, smiling, certain it would end the way it always had. But arrogance makes men careless. The questions didn't stop. The evidence didn't vanish. And the men sitting across from him no longer looked impressed. When he finally spoke, it wasn't fear that loosened his tongue. It was pride. He admitted it like it was something clever. Like breaking a life was a lesson, not a crime. She needed to be reminded of her place. The room went still. Music. That was the moment everything shifted. Not because Zyra was Apache, not because anyone suddenly grew a conscience, but because the truth had been laid bare, and it was uglier than anyone could pretend not to see. Charges were filed. The Holt name showed up in print for reasons it never had before. Allies backed away. Doors closed. Influence started to crumble under the weight of exposure. At the ranch, the news came in on a hard wind. Thorne stood beside Zyra as she listened, her hands clenched at her sides, her face unreadable. When it was over, she didn't cry, didn't smile either. "It's done," someone said. She shook her head slowly. "No, it's finally music scene." Justice didn't arrive wrapped in apologies. Some people couldn't meet her eyes anymore, for different reasons now. Others gave quiet nods. A few offered words they'd kept buried too long. But Zyra didn't measure it by any of that. She measured it by one simple thing. The lie was gone. It didn't follow her anymore. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in copper and gold, she stood beside Thorne on the porch, the wind pulling gently music at her hair. "They didn't save me," she said. Thorne looked at her. "You didn't need saving." The truth did. And for the first time since she'd stepped onto that road alone, the darkness behind her didn't reach quite as far. The truth had risen. Not with kindness, not with mercy, but with the quiet, steady force of music, something that refused to stay buried. And whether they wanted to or not, everyone had to face it. She never went back to town, not out of fear, not out of bitterness. Her name had been cleared. The lie that chased her through those streets had lost its teeth. But the town itself hadn't changed, still built on habit, on memory, slow to move. Even when forced to look itself in the eye, she didn't return to her people either. They were still part of her, woven deep into the way she walked, the way she worked the land, the way she understood silence. But she had crossed too far, seen too much. There was no stepping back into that life without carrying everything that had come with it. So she stayed. She stayed on the ranch. What started as work became routine. What became routine turned into something shared. Thorne never asked her to choose. Music. And she never asked him for permission. The land made the decision for them, slow and certain, season by season. When spring came, they cleared a small stretch near the road. Just enough space for a simple stand Thorne built with his own hands. Rough boards, sanded smooth. Zyra painted the sign careful, her letters steady, plain. No promises, just truth. Fresh bread. Music, simple pastries, food made slow, made right. The first morning they opened, one truck stopped, then another. Some faces she knew, others she didn't. People came because word traveled different when it wasn't twisted by fear. They stayed, music, because the food was good, and the place felt real. The ranch changed with them. Fields filled out stronger. The books stayed balanced. The house no longer echoed when the door shut at night. Laughter came slow at first, uncertain, then easier. Thorne found himself thinking ahead, not just getting through the season, but planning for the next. The question came quiet. No grand moment, just an evening, the sun sitting low over the fields. Thorne stood beside her on the porch, hands worn, voice steady. He didn't promise easy. didn't promise safe. He promised something else. Choice made every day. Zyra didn't hesitate. She said yes. The wedding was small. No town hall, no crowd, no spectacle. Just a handful of people who mattered, gathered near the creek that ran through the land like it had always known its way forward. Zyra wore a simple dress she had stitched herself. Clean lines, nothing unnecessary. Thorne stood beside her in Kesler's old jacket, carefully mended, still carrying the weight of another life in its seams. They spoke their vows without decoration. No grand promises, just quiet words about standing together, about listening when it mattered, about choosing each other again, even on the days it would be easier not to. The wind moved soft through the grass, like the land itself was listening, like it understood. Life didn't become easier after that. But it became steady. They worked side by side. Some days stretched long. Some nights settled into a silence that felt earned, not empty. And then, one evening, as the sky burned gold and red along the horizon, Zyra took Thorne's hand and placed it gently against her stomach. No announcement, no words, just truth passed between them. Something new was coming. The thought of it, of a child who would grow knowing both where they came from and where they chose to stand, settled into Thorne slow at first, then all at once. The rooms that had once held nothing but quiet began to feel like they were waiting for sound. Years from now, people might tell their story different. They might soften it, or twist it sharper than it was. They might say the rancher saved the Apache woman, or that love somehow mended what history had broken. None of that would be true. Love didn't erase what came before. It didn't rewrite loss, didn't pretend the land hadn't known blood long before fences carved it up. But it proved something else. On an ordinary evening, they stood together on the porch, hands linked, music watching the sun fall behind the fields. The land stretched wide and glowing, no longer empty, no longer alone. Two people, once pushed aside in different ways, had built something real, something that didn't ask for permission to exist. They had learned something simple and hard. Family wasn't always something you were born into. Sometimes it was something you chose, and sometimes choosing it, quiet, stubborn, and honest, was the most human thing a person could do.